whatever the reasons for frustrated Palestinians turning to Hamas or Islamic Jihad, and whatever the failings of this thing we're in now that we're calling the peace process, does that group of frustrated people have the ability to scuttle the process and to at least take people away from the table where they're negotiating some sort of a perhaps less violent future for the Middle East?
Yes, they have that ability, but then again, you have to define more cleverly, I think, what the powers that be actually want. Neither the Israelis nor the Americans, in my judgment, want a real, quiet, dignified, just peace. I believe both the Americans and the Israelis want a controlled level of tension. It suits their interests and their needs much better. It makes it much more possible not to have to discuss democracy in Saudi Arabia, much more possible not to have to discuss repression, torture in Egypt, not to have to discuss how 30,000 people in the last year or two have been killed in Algeria because democracy was subverted by the military with the help of the American CIA and the Arab establishment. So you have to look at the Middle East in a different way. The Middle East is organized by families and regimes. None of these regimes, including the ones like Assad in Syria, would last for a month if it weren't for the military and covert capabilities that they are helped with by Western governments. Now, Syria is a special case, but even with Syria, we want that regime to stay in power. So what does this mean in the end? It means that you have not so much a peace process, but you have sort of a controlled order process. You have a situation in which the President of the United States gets up and talks about democracy and human rights and a peaceful Middle East, but all the institutions of the American government perpetuate the system of client regimes, repression, and police states in the Middle East. The American people get confused, and then something like the World Trade Tower gets blown up, and people wonder, how could these people be so animalistic and crazy to do something of this? Well, these are the same people that for decades now have had Western bombers flying over their cities dropping bombs. And if they weren't Western bombers, they were bombers sold to various countries that dropped bombs that were made in Britain or in England. What just happened in Iran, where you had millions of people killed when the Iraqis invaded back in 1980? What just happened to Iraq, which was decimated by American power? And it had little to do with Kuwait. It had mostly to do with America imposing its will on the region against a power that was developing independent means of mass destruction and threatening our major ally, Israel. Look at Egypt today, becoming more and more a repressive police state with terrible human rights abuses.
You were making the world's only known connection between Algerian democracy, FIS, and Jerry Falwell.
Well, what I was trying to point out was that it's very convenient for the United States, the empire, the hegemonic power, and derivatively for Israel. If there's a controlled level of conflict, certain amount of tension, certain amount of terrorism, certain amount of challenge to American interests, to the regimes in the region, it becomes much more convenient somehow to overlook that Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are police states that don't even have the smallest semblance of any kind of human rights that we understand to be necessary for society, to overlook the repressive police state nature of Egypt, which gets worse and worse by the week, to overlook that 30,000 Algerians have been killed and tortured by a terribly brutal military government that is still going to lose, it appears. And maybe if the Americans thought of it in this way, what if Jerry Falwell, or someone of his kind, actually succeeded in getting a lot of votes and in a 3 or 4 way election was elected President of the United States? And then what if there were a military coup? And the military said, we won't allow this man and this party and this group of people to become the political establishment in this country. Well, there'd be terrible rebellion here. It's unthinkable that such a thing could happen in this country. Yet that's what happened in Algeria. These fundamentalists who are so disdained in the American media worked for a generation, built up their support, and were about to be popularly elected to be the government of Algeria. So what happened? The military took over, and who helped the military take over? The Western powers, the American CIA, and the regimes in the region, all of whom feel terribly threatened by their own populace. So you've got to factor all of this social and political awareness into the mixture when you use terms like peace process and diplomatic meetings. And let's take the example of September it was, 1993. A few days before, Yasser Arafat was a terrorist who couldn't come to the United States and who was vilified. All of a sudden, he's welcome at the White House. He's giving a speech on national television in front of the whole American population. Well, what happened? Yasser Arafat was the same Yasser Arafat. It's simply that he had acquiesced. Yasser Arafat had surrendered. Because he surrendered, he was invited to come. And since it's a modern era, unlike 100 years ago when Geronimo was required to hand over his gun and the soldier vanquished him to get on a train and sent him to Florida with a promise that he'd come back in 2 years, but of course he never came back. Yasser Arafat was given the right to surrender by claiming victory. But the very man who had headed up his negotiating team, the very man who at Madrid was the centerpiece for the Palestinian delegation, Dr. Haider Abdul Shafi, wasn't in the audience. Now, did you hear on your TV that major personalities from the Palestinian side wouldn't even come to the ceremony? No, you didn't hear that. You heard all the hoopla, you saw all the flags waving, you saw everybody shaking hands. It didn't look like a surrender ceremony. But the people in the Middle East, many of the people in the Middle East knew what it was. And there's another dimension here too, the media, the popular media. Now, there are plenty of independent small journals. I have written for many of them. But these reach a few thousand people, a few select experts in the field. So we all get our major information and we all establish the parameters of how we think based on the big newspapers, the big television channels. Who owns them? They're either owned by elements of the American establishment, which is almost always connected to the corporate and military elite in the country. In the case of the Arab world, who owns them? The regimes own them. The brother of the king of Saudi Arabia owns this one. A business partner of some person in Jordan owns this one, Ad-Dastur in Jordan. In Israel, it's a little different, but even there, the media is pretty much owned by the corporate, industrial, military establishment. So the average citizen really doesn't get any independent sources of information, which is why that even something like Dr. Abdul Shafi, who just a few years ago was the chief spokesman of the Palestinian cause, the fact that he won't even come to the ceremony, nobody even mentions. These things create an aura in which Americans and people in the West are badly misled about the realities of the situation. So you talked to me about peace process. I was just there a few weeks ago. I didn't see a peace process. I saw tension. I saw humiliation. I saw aggravation. I saw fear. I saw a man in the hotel, a very nice young man, who wanted to talk to me about how he felt about Egypt. He's not political. He's just a nice person working in a restaurant. Very competent, by the way. But he wouldn't talk to me on the camera. And he told me later because he was afraid. He would talk to me off camera. And he told me that Egypt was depressed. That Egypt had lost its dignity. That even though he had his family here, he wanted to leave. There was no opportunity for him here. Everything was repressed here. Now, think about the Palestinians for a moment. The Palestinians are being locked behind gates and fences. Gaza is essentially a big prison. The Israelis let people out of their prisons where they had to feed them and take care of them, and they sent them to other prisons. They locked them up behind Gaza, and they told Yasser Arafat, you administer this prison, and if you do a good job, we'll also let you administer the prisons of Hebron and Nablus and other population centers. But when the Palestinians talk about, well, what about statehood? What about Resolution 242? What about the Green Line? What about our independence? What about our national dignity? Nobody wants to talk to them about that. So essentially, what has Yasser Arafat become? He's become a warden of Gaza prison. And that's why when he holds executive committee meetings, like the couple that he's held since going back to Gaza, he hardly even gets a quorum. His own people won't even come and participate in the charade that is perpetuated under the term peace process.
If we can't turn back history to change the demographic nature of Jerusalem, can we at least turn it back to grab an idea from the past, making Jerusalem an international city, or making Jerusalem one city that can be the capital of two different states?
Look, in theory, Peter, you can do all kinds of things. What should have happened with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we were presented with actually a very positive option. After the '67 war, there was a green line. There was a definable Palestine and a definable Israel. The just solution that would have changed the tensions and the attitudes, and the just solution, which is still not totally impossible, but I don't want anybody to think that I think it's going to come about, was the two-state solution. It wasn't ideal, but nevertheless it would have given the Palestinians fulfillment of their aspirations, would have given the Jews and the Israelis fulfillment of their aspirations. There are lots of reasons it didn't come about, but the primary reason is that the Israelis, and through the Israelis, the Americans, in most cases the Americans being manipulated by the Israelis on this issue, simply didn't want it to come about. Now we've reached a point where the demographics, the building, the settlements, the very nature of how Jerusalem is laid out on the ground physically has reached a point where it's not real anymore. The Israelis would have to make far more compromises and changes and leave areas and turn buildings over to Palestinians. That kind of thing isn't going to be done by agreement when that party is already on top with the backing of the United States. That kind of thing would only be done in the aftermath of a war, or if the Arabs had countervailing pressure and countervailing power, which they don't have. Now, on the other hand, I would not want to judge how the Middle East is going to look 10 years from now. I would not want to bet that a Mubarak-type government is still going to be in power in Egypt. I wouldn't want to bet on the Hashemites. I wouldn't want to bet on the Saudis. Look what we've gone through in the last 15 or 20 years in terms of turmoil in the region. On the other hand, the American war against Iraq was sort of a statement that the United States, the empire, working through international institutions when possible, but negating them if necessary, is going to maintain the status quo, going to maintain the boundaries, the regimes, and the system, if at all possible. That's what the Americans said to the region, and that's why so much tension has been building up in the region. But also look at it this way, it's sort of a big scam. The Americans maintain a certain level of tension. They buy plentiful cheap oil, even though they could produce their own oil, but it would cost them more and they would be depleting it. They buy plentiful cheap oil. Then what happens? The Israelis give a few billion dollars, the Israelis are given a few $1 billion a year to buy American arms. This money flows back to American arms industries. In return, the Arab regimes buy $15 or $20 billion in petrodollar arms. So who really gains by this? The United States gains at every turn. Plentiful oil, cheap oil, artificially inflating the standard of living of the United States, because essentially the black gold of the industrial age is ours for the taking at cheap prices. Then the petrodollars are recycled into the American arms and banking industries. And in a sense, it's a scam that goes on. And the reason it can be maintained is because we then use some of that money and some of that power and some of those arms to keep our rulers in place. These leaders are largely despised, but they rule through terror. And then the American president gets up in front of the country and at State of the Union messages and has the audacity to talk of democracy and human rights and peace in the Arab world. And when you look at it through that kind of a lens, it shouldn't be so hard to understand that a lot of people snicker. And a lot of people, raise their eyebrows. And a lot of other people say, people who don't have options, who don't have jobs, who only have history and dignity and family, a lot of other people say, we're going to fight against this. And we're going to try to impose our values, our religion, our political philosophy, and most importantly, our own indigenous leaders. That's what we want. And that's where the irony of someone like myself comes in. After so many trips to the region, one starts off as a Jewish American I was mostly a Zionist in my student days. I worked for the American Jewish Congress and worked for the World Jewish Congress as their representative for 10 years. But the irony is that if one believes in human rights, democracy, national dignity, one has to be a supporter of those who are fighting against the systems of government and the regimes that have been imposed on them in the region, which creates a somewhat incongruous situation for someone like myself. But I'm certainly not unique or alone. I know a lot of people in the region. Not in Washington. I mean, we've had this discussion. Washington's the land of the body snatchers. Just about everybody who talks about the Middle East here is doing so always looking over their shoulder to who's funding their institute, who's pulling their strings, who's going to see this film, this documentary, this CD. It's the land of the body snatchers and the land of the anxious. So you'll find very few people in this city that are willing to just sit down, have a free-willing discussion in front of a camera. Much, much better if you put the cameras and the tape recorders away, gain their trust, and have, just a private discussion. But Washington is not really a place of private discussions. Everything here is imagery, hype, media, fighting for time on TV.
And now, this week's quote of the week. This week, Shimon Peres, Foreign Minister of Israel, speaking not here in the United States or on international television, but at an Israeli cabinet meeting. Quote, "We are doing our best to see that no settler is evacuated. We did not concede on anything that was in our possession. We did not concede on Gaza. Rather, we freed ourselves from Gaza. We did not come to negotiations with the PLO because we have changed, but because it has changed." Now, just as David Ben-Gurion, Peres's mentor, lied to the Palestinians about the intentions to create a separatist Jewish state in their country, so Shimon Peres follows in the deceptive tradition of the Israeli Labor Party.
Well, we've heard a lot of these arguments before. We've heard arguments about ulterior motives for the outside world's interest in the Middle East. But we have to face this reality that this peace process has been entered into, willingly it would appear, by all the participants. The Palestinians are involved. Israel and all its neighboring states are involved. There must be something to this process, or why are they in it?
Well, I don't think that's correct either. The peace process, if I'm to use your language, which I don't really accept as the correct language, I would say what's happening in the Middle East today is that two factors came into play in the last 10 years. Three factors. The end of the Cold War, meaning there was no longer the major competition between the Soviets and the Americans. Two, the rise of Islamic nationalist fundamentalism, which is actually midwifed by Western involvement, because who are these people reacting against? Who are they fighting against? They're fighting against the client regimes that have been imposed on them. And then three, of course, you've got the Israeli involvement in the affairs of the region. Israel started off as a small, weak power, but has become the dominant nuclear power. You have a state of 4 million Jews dominating the affairs of the region with over 200 million Arab, mostly Muslims, some Christians. So all these factors came into play. What you've got is a political process that after the Gulf War was pushed forward by the Americans. The Americans had just destroyed an Arab country, and they had participated in the destruction of Iran by encouraging Iraq to attack Iran in the first place. The Americans, I think, felt a desperate need for a public relations victory, that they be perceived not as an empire, but more as a good Samaritan. Now, imagery is very important in the Middle East, even more important than in the Western world. And that imagery of going to Madrid, creating a peace process, was very important, I think, to the Bush administration. Now, the Israelis had been in favor of this kind of thing all along. Shamir gave the impression that he was kicked and dragged and screaming and hollering. Shamir wanted, as all Israelis have wanted, to sit at a table with the Arab states and be accepted. It was a form of legitimacy even before there were any signed agreements. The Palestinians had been defeated. I mean, let's call it straight. There is no PLO anymore. PLO was destroyed. It was destroyed by the Israelis, the Americans, and by Arab regimes that were afraid of it. And in the aftermath of the Gulf War, it was a good time to stop the funding, stop the pretense. Yasser Arafat hardly existed at that moment. He was literally bankrupt. He was a figurehead that had nowhere to go. His choices were either simply abdication and acknowledging his total defeat, or he did what many Arab leaders have done over the years. He allowed himself to become another client regime. He was bought by his enemies, who said to him essentially the following: you're not going to get a state. You're not going to get what you've been fighting for. Your people are vanquished. But if you, Yasser Arafat, will go and take charge, because we don't want to take charge. There's this place, Gaza. 1 million Palestinians living in poverty, turning into Hamas terrorists. We've had our fill of it. I've heard the Israelis since the 70s talk about the Gaza First option. And the impression is given that the Israeli Labor Party turned over some big new leaf and all of a sudden decided to recognize the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. That's all nonsense. The Israeli Labor Party, going back to the 60s with the Alon Plan, had always said that pockets of Palestinian population should be autonomously administered by the Palestinians, preferably in combination with Jordan. They insisted on what they called security rights, the right to settle. Basically, they've taken 72% of the land, most of the water resources. They've encased Jerusalem in an Israeli-Jewish concubine arrangement. So the PLO was gone. This wasn't something that was done willingly. This was more like Geronimo being told to hand over his gun and he won't be shot. And I don't know if you recall that Yasser Arafat actually, it's unbelievable, he actually, at the White House ceremony, wanted to hand over his gun to the President of the United States right there on the podium. That's how bad the whole thing had gotten. Now, of course, the imagery of presenting this is different. You tell the American people in the world, we've achieved a breakthrough. All the parties have come to the negotiating table. Well, who are the parties that have come to the table? The government of Egypt, which is essentially a military government. You redress generals in civilian uniforms, you give them American money and CIA protection, and an unpopular regime continues to rule Egypt. What is the Hashemite regime? Put there by the British, by Winston Churchill, by British funds, by CIA funds, and imposed on Jordan. What is the Saudi regime? The Saud family. What is the Al-Sabah family? There's no semblance of democracy or human rights in any of these places. It's the complete opposite of what Bill Clinton says every time he gets up and speaks about the subject. But the average American hasn't been to these places. The average American has a hard enough time remembering American history and the Civil War and the war against Britain. If you try to explain to the average American that the Palestinian PLO, when it was in existence, that the Hamas of today, that the nationalist revolutionaries in the Arab world see themselves like Paul Revere, see themselves like they are fighting against when the Americans fought against the British, that they don't want taxation without representation. They don't want to be ruled by foreigners. They don't want to have to pay homage to a foreign king. Now, the average American can then begin to, realize that maybe there's a whole side to this, pick the whole way of looking at this problem in the Middle East, these problems in the Middle East that they haven't been exposed to. And when you start looking at it through these different lenses and in these different ways, you begin to reach very different conclusions.